There are 6 silent reasons why people hate you, and none of them are about who you truly are. It's not the words you said or the things you did. It's what your presence awakens in them, what you reflect back. You walk into the room and suddenly they're uncomfortable. Not because you attacked them, but because something about you forces them to confront parts of themselves they've buried. The confidence you carry, the boundaries you've built, the peace they never found. To them, you become a reminder of what they gave up, what they never started, or what they're still running from. And that reflection, that's what they hate. This video is not about blaming them or praising yourself. It's about understanding the quiet psychology behind why others project hate onto people who simply choose to live fully. Because once you understand that, you stop shrinking, you stop apologizing for growing, and you finally reclaim your peace. If you're on a path of self-mastery, if you're trying to build a mind that isn't shaken by opinion or rejection, please subscribe, because the inner work deserves a space where it's respected. Welcome to Stoic Journal. 1. You remind them of what they're not. You don't have to say a word. Just being you, calm, confident, composed, can set off alarms in someone else's soul. You're not walking into the room to prove anything, but still, the moment you enter, something changes. You notice the shift, a stare too long, a laugh that feels off, energy that turns cold, and yet you did nothing wrong. You were just being. But what most people don't realize is how threatening just being can be when it exposes what others are trying so hard to hide. See, your presence becomes a silent confrontation. Not with your words, not with your actions, but with your existence. It reminds people of their silence when they should have spoken, their hesitation when they should have moved, their comfort zone that slowly turned into a cage. And that kind of reminder hurts, especially when it comes from someone who's not trying to hurt anyone. When someone has avoided their own growth for years, they don't want to be reminded that growth is possible, that risk is worth it, that the excuses they've been feeding themselves no longer hold up in the presence of someone who chose differently. You become a mirror, not the polished kind that flatters, but the raw, honest kind that doesn't filter the truth. And when people are living in denial, truth can feel like an attack. So they flinch, they get defensive, and in that defensiveness, they might mock you, dismiss you, or even hate you, because it's easier to discredit you than to deal with the discomfort you awaken in them. They might say you're arrogant, too intense, trying too hard, or that you changed. But that's not about you. That's about them trying to make sense of something that challenges the narrative they've built around their own choices. You didn't change. You evolved. You took your own path. And people who are stuck don't hate you because you left them behind. They hate that you proved they could have come too. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "If someone is able to show me that what I think or do is not right, I will happily change, for I seek the truth," by which no one was ever truly harmed. But not everyone is ready to seek truth. Not everyone is ready to face themselves in the reflection you unintentionally offer, and so they blame the mirror. This is where you have to stay strong. Because the moment you start shrinking yourself to be less offensive, to dull your edge, to dim your glow, you're no longer protecting them, you're betraying you. Stoicism teaches us to live in accordance with nature, and your nature isn't to make others comfortable by being less. Your nature is to grow, to expand, to live aligned with what's real and what matters. That means being okay with the discomfort your presence may cause in people who haven't yet made peace with their own choices. It means understanding that hate is sometimes a cry of regret, dressed in bitterness. That resentment is often disappointment that's looking for someone to blame, and that none of it is yours to carry. You don't need to explain yourself to those who are committed to misunderstanding you. You don't need to soften your spirit for people who never asked how you built it, and you don't owe a single apology for the peace you earned, the boundaries you hold, or the light you carry. If someone feels less than in your presence, it doesn't mean you're being more than. It means they have work to do, and that's their responsibility, not yours. Don't interrupt your growth to make someone else feel better about standing still. Keep showing up. Keep choosing discipline over comfort. Keep choosing self-respect over approval. Because those who belong in your life won't feel threatened by your shine. They'll be lit up by it. Let them feel what they feel. Let them look if they must. And let them say whatever they need to say to sleep better at night. That's their path. Yours is to keep walking in truth, even when that truth makes others uncomfortable, because the world doesn't need more people pretending. It needs more people living, authentically, unapologetically, stoically. 2. You trigger their insecurities. Some people flinch the moment you walk in, and not because you did anything wrong, but because something about you reminds them of where they're not. We all carry wounds. Some are buried deep, others still ache at the surface. And when you show up living freely, speaking with ease, smiling without apology, you can unknowingly brush up against those raw edges. It's not intentional. You're not trying to stand out or be better, but your presence becomes a contrast, one that highlights what they lack or never built within themselves. Maybe you're naturally confident in a way they've always struggled to be. Maybe you're taking action while they've been stuck in the same job, the same mindset, the same fear. Maybe you speak your truth, and they've been biting their tongue for years. That contrast is sharp. It stings. And when someone hasn't done the internal work to face it, they protect their ego the only way it knows how, by turning you into the problem. It's not unusual for people to label what threatens them. They'll call your confidence arrogance, your peace fake, your growth just luck. Because if they can convince themselves that your success isn't real, they don't have to face the possibility that they could have had it too. It's easier for someone to say you're pretending than to admit they've been avoiding. Easier to paint you as unrelatable than to question why they gave up on becoming their own best version. This is projection. It's not new, and it's not personal. When people don't want to deal with their own discomfort, they push it outward. They frame your light as an attack, your clarity as a show, your stability as a lie. But none of that belongs to you. It's just their pain, dressed up and directed at the nearest target. The Stoics understood this pattern long before psychology gave it a name. Epictetus said, "When someone provokes you, realize that it is your own opinion which provokes you." What that means is simple. The trigger is not in you, it's in them. You didn't press the button, they already had the button installed. You were just the reminder. And that reminder makes them uncomfortable because it shatters the illusion they've been maintaining. The illusion that they're doing fine, that their bitterness is justified, that everyone else is just pretending too. But when they see you laughing genuinely, speaking openly, moving with a purpose, it gets harder to cling to that illusion. And so their discomfort turns to criticism. This is where many people start to shrink. You notice the tone in their voice change. You hear the subtle dig. You feel the withdrawal. And part of you wants to explain, to justify, to make yourself smaller so they don't feel as small around you. But that's not your job. You're not here to shrink for people who refuse to grow. You're not responsible for the emotions they haven't processed. And you're certainly not obligated to dull your light so they don't feel like they're in the dark. Let them feel what they feel. Let them say what they say. Because their judgment isn't a reflection of who you are. It's a reflection of who they're not yet ready to become. That doesn't make them bad people. It just means they're in a different place on the path. Everyone's got their own timing, their own battles, their own inner dialogue playing on repeat. Some people haven't had the tools, the space, or the courage to change that script. But none of that means you should lower your volume to make their silence feel better. Stand tall, keep doing the work, and remember, you didn't provoke them. Their unhealed places did. What they're reacting to is not you. It's the version of themselves they wish they were. the one they see every time they see you. So what do? You stay grounded, you stay kind, but you don't apologize. You show compassion, but you don't absorb their pain as your own, and you keep walking forward, even if it means walking alone for a while. Because the people who belong in your life will never ask you to be less just so they can feel more. They'll admire your growth, they'll respect your peace, and they'll use your light as a reason to heal, not a reason to hate. You will trigger people. That's part of growth. And ironically, the more peaceful and whole you become, the more those who are restless and broken will try to poke holes in your calm. Let them, because their discomfort is not a sign you're doing something wrong, it's a sign you're doing something right. 3. You have something they want. Sometimes people won't hate you for being wrong. They'll hate you for having what they secretly wish they had. Not because you stole it, not because you rubbed it in their face, but simply because it's yours. That quiet confidence, the peace you carry in your chest, the relationships that feel warm and real, the momentum you've built in your life, all of it becomes something they silently measure themselves against. And instead of turning that discomfort into curiosity, like, how did you get there? Or what could I learn from this? They choose resentment. Not openly, of course. It hides behind subtle shade, behind smiles that don't reach the eyes, behind phrases like, must be nice, or I could do that too if I had the time. But the truth is, what you have reflects what they don't, and for some, that's unbearable. You didn't ask to be compared to anyone. You didn't wake up and decide to become someone else's measuring stick. But when you start owning your life, really owning it, it shines a light on the things other people have abandoned. That light exposes their compromises, their self-betrayals, their decisions to settle. And instead of confronting all that, they'll attack what they see in you. That's how jealousy survives, by twisting admiration into criticism. You'll hear that you're fake, that you're lucky, that your life is all surface and no substance. Because if they admit you earned it, they'd have to admit that they didn't try, or that they tried and gave up, or worse, that they never believed they could in the first place. It's easier to call you undeserving than to ask why they've chosen the path they're on. Jealousy isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet contempt, a subtle tension in the room, a backhanded compliment, a silence when you share good news. It's the invisible resistance you feel when you're doing well around people who aren't. And you'll start to notice it more the better your life gets. The more you heal, the more it threatens the narratives others cling to. Because when you're healthy, grounded and moving forward, it challenges the people still stuck in their pain. Carl Jung once said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely," and most people haven't. So when they see you doing that, flawed but free, it rattles something in them. Not because you're arrogant, but because they've spent so long pretending not to want what you have. This is where you have to stay anchored, because their jealousy will try to become your shame. It will try to guilt you into shrinking, into second-guessing your wins, into questioning if maybe you are too much, too lucky, too ahead. Don't fall for it. Jealousy is just someone else's refusal to take responsibility for their life. It's a confession, not an accusation. And it says more about where they are than where you're headed. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Don't waste time wondering what a good man is. Be one." You don't have to explain your blessings. You just have to embody them well. Keep walking, even when they gossip, even when they twist your story, even when they try to make your growth look like betrayal. Keep walking, because the ones who belong in your life will never be threatened by your light. They'll sit beside you and share the warmth. But the ones who can't handle it, let them walk themselves out. You don't need to downplay your progress to make others feel comfortable in their stagnation. Your joy is not a crime. Your peace is not a provocation. You're not wrong for having something others want. You're just living proof that it's possible. And here's the thing most people miss. Jealousy doesn't need to become war. You don't need to fight, defend, or retaliate. You can just let it be. Let it sting, let it pass, let it teach. Because in the end, the people who are meant to rise with you will use their envy as fuel, not poison. They'll look at you and think, if they can, maybe I can too. And they'll thank you, not hate you, for showing them what's possible. But the ones who'd rather sit in bitterness, that's not your burden to carry. Let them stay where they are. You've got somewhere to be. 4. You can't be controlled. Some people only love you when you're easy to bend, when you're agreeable, when you nod without questioning, when you say yes to things that make your stomach twist. As long as you play the role they wrote for you, they smile. They call you loyal, kind, selfless. But the moment you say, actually no, the moment you start to make decisions that serve your own growth instead of their comfort, the entire energy changes. You're no longer the version of you they could manage. You've stepped out of the script, and suddenly you're difficult, selfish, distant. They don't hate the real you. They hate the uncontrollable you. Control doesn't always come with raised voices or demands. More often it's dressed in disappointment. It's in the guilt you feel after doing what's right for you. It's in the way someone says, I guess you've changed, as if growth were betrayal. It's in the silence that follows your boundary, and you start to question, was I wrong to speak up? Should I have just gone along with it? That self-doubt is exactly how control operates, not by force, but by conditioning you to feel bad for choosing yourself. But the moment you step into who you really are, no filter, no role, no need for approval, you begin to see who actually loved you and who just loved having access to you. There's a quiet kind of courage in saying no without explaining, in living your truth without needing someone else's permission. And that courage, it scares people who only know how to connect through compliance. They'll push back, they'll test the edges of your resolve. They'll try to make you feel like your independence is a weapon, but it's not. It's your birthright. Seneca said, "No man is free who is a slave to the opinion of others." And most people don't realize how deeply they've been conditioned to obey, not just by society, but by the subtle emotional contracts they've signed in relationships. Be agreeable and you'll be loved. Be quiet and you'll be accepted. Be useful and you'll be kept. But when you start saying no to those contracts, some people treat it like betrayal. Not because you wronged them, but because you interrupted the comfort of their expectations. Choosing yourself doesn't mean you're rejecting others. It means you're refusing to be edited by them. And that's a line most people won't understand until they've done the inner work themselves. Because when you grow into your autonomy, you stop needing approval for every step you take. You start living from your values, not their validation. You say yes from your soul, not from guilt. And that shift creates friction with anyone who benefited from the old version of you. You'll see this most clearly in people who once called themselves close. Friends who pull away when you don't show up like you used to. Family members who act wounded when you stop letting them guilt you into their plans. Romantic partners who claim you're being distant when you're finally being honest. But that's not distance, it's clarity. And clarity often looks like rebellion to those who thrived on your confusion. There's no need to fight, no need to argue, explain, or prove yourself. The people who truly love you will adjust to your boundaries. They might not understand them right away, but they'll respect them. The rest, let them fall away, not in anger, but in peace. Because your path was never meant to be crowded by people who only loved you on their terms. And the truth is, if someone's love depends on your compliance, it was never love, it was a transaction. Carl Jung said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." And becoming who you truly are means shedding the version of you that was crafted to make other people feel safe. It means standing up for your needs, even when your voice shakes. It means walking away from comfort, if that comfort comes at the cost of your self-respect. And it means being okay with being misunderstood, because sometimes the price of inner peace is external conflict. And that's a trade worth making. You weren't born to be manageable. You weren't built to be agreeable at your own expense. You are allowed to evolve. You are allowed to disappoint people who expected you to stay small. And you are allowed to create a life that reflects your truth, not their template. So if they hate you for choosing yourself, let them. That hate has nothing to do with who you are. It has everything to do with who they can no longer control. 5. You represent their lost potential. There's a particular kind of silence you'll feel from people who once cheered you on, people who, in another life, might have walked beside you. At first it feels confusing. You haven't hurt them. You haven't rubbed anything in their face. But the air between you shifts. The warmth becomes distance, and all you've done is move forward. What you start to realize is that your life, just as it is, has become a painful reflection for them. Not because you're living too loudly, but because you're living the life they once imagined for themselves. A version of them long buried starts to echo in the presence of what you've built. And instead of celebrating your progress, they begin to resent it, not because it's wrong, but because it reminds them of every moment they stood still. You didn't take their opportunity. You didn't outshine them. You just started. You acted on the dreams they only spoke about. You stayed consistent when things got hard. You made peace with uncertainty and chose to move anyway. And that alone, your willingness to risk, to grow, to change, becomes a threat. Because it makes one thing brutally clear: they could have too, but they didn't. And now, watching you succeed forces them to face what they traded their potential for: comfort, fear, approval, distraction. That's a hard truth for anyone to swallow. They'll rarely admit that. Instead, they'll shift the narrative. They'll say you got lucky, that your timing was perfect, that you had advantages they didn't. Some will even say, you've changed, as if remaining unchanged is a virtue. But what they're really saying is, you kept going when I stopped. That's what stings. Because your path reveals what theirs could have been. You become a reminder that regret doesn't just stay in the past. It shows up in the present, wearing the face of someone who chose differently. Carl Jung once said, "Nothing has a stronger influence psychologically on their environment, and especially on their children, than the unlived life of the parent." And that unlived life doesn't disappear. It lingers, it festers, it leaks into conversations, into tension, into resentment. And when you walk into a room full of people who gave up on themselves, your presence won't feel like light. It'll feel like exposure. Not because you're doing anything wrong, but because they've built their life around pretending that their dream wasn't real to begin with, and then you show up as proof that it was. You don't need to apologize for that. You're not a ghost of someone else's potential. You're not a villain in someone's internal dialogue. You are not obligated to slow your pace just because someone else stopped walking. You didn't live their life for them. You lived yours. And that's not arrogance. That's responsibility. The kind too many people abandon when it gets uncomfortable. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "It is not death that a man should fear, but he should fear never beginning to live." And most people never begin, not because they're incapable, but because they're afraid of leaving behind the version of themselves the world has accepted. You left, you began, and now you're here, holding the weight of your own choices and the quiet disappointment of others who didn't make theirs. That's a heavy thing to carry if you let it be, but you don't have to. Their regret is not your burden. You didn't choose their limits. You don't have to inherit their shame. And no matter how softly they say it, "Must be nice" is not a compliment. It's a confession. A whisper from a life that stopped moving. One that watches you now, not with hatred, but with the ache of 1,000 what-ifs they never dared to answer. Let them feel what they feel. You're not the villain. You're the possibility they abandoned. That makes people uncomfortable. But discomfort is where growth begins, if they choose to meet it. Some will, some won't. But your job was never to convince them. Your job is to keep building, keep healing, Keep becoming the version of yourself you once dreamed about, because regret doesn't need another witness. It needs a reason to wake up. You are not better than them. You are not more worthy. You just moved when they froze, and that movement created a ripple they weren't ready for. It doesn't make you wrong. It makes you free. So keep walking, keep evolving. And when you feel the weight of someone else's lost potential on your shoulders, shake it off. That's not your shadow, that's theirs. You've got a life to live. Keep going. 6. Your joy threatens their misery. There's a certain discomfort people feel when someone else finds peace. Not because peace is offensive, but because it reveals what they've been refusing to believe, that joy is still available, that healing is possible, that life doesn't have to be lived in bitterness and noise. Some people hold on to misery like it's a badge of honor. They've wrapped their identity around struggle, around the belief that life is nothing but survival. And when you show up, smiling, grounded, laughing softly at nothing, they don't see someone lucky. They see a contradiction, a disruption to the story they've built to justify staying exactly where they are. And that disruption feels like an attack, even though you haven't said a word. You're not preaching. You're not even trying to inspire anyone. You're just existing with a little bit more lightness in your step. But even that is too much for someone who's decided happiness is a lie. You don't need to say anything for your joy to trigger their defenses. It's in how you speak, how you breathe, how you don't react to chaos, how you walk away from drama instead of fueling it. And that calm, that contentment, it threatens the foundation of their worldview. Because if you found a way to be okay, then maybe they could have too. But instead of asking how, they'll try to convince you that your peace isn't real. They'll pick at it, subtly, then openly. That won't last. You're naive. Life hasn't hit you yet. They'll speak like prophets of pain, as if joy were a crime against reality. But it's not. Joy is a rebellion. In a world built on stress and outrage, joy is one of the most radical things you can embody. And when people see you living it, they have two choices: be curious or be critical. Most choose critical, not because they hate you, but because they've made peace with their misery. It's familiar, it's predictable, and they're not ready to question it. Carl Jung once wrote, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls." That includes mocking someone else's happiness, because to take your joy seriously would mean facing the parts of themselves they've neglected. It would mean admitting they gave up on hope, on healing, on softness. So instead, they turn your light into a target. But that's not your problem to solve. Your peace isn't a challenge for others to pass. It's your own quiet revolution. And it doesn't need anyone's validation to be real. Some will say you're pretending, that no one can be that content, but you're not faking anything. You've just stopped waiting for life to be perfect before you let yourself breathe. You've stopped tying your joy to outcomes and started rooting it in presence. And that shift makes people nervous, because we live in a culture where complaining bonds people more than truth does, where vulnerability gets mistaken for weakness, where being at peace is seen as being out of touch. But you're not out of touch. You're finally in alignment. Aristotle said, "Happiness is not to be sought in the approval of others, but in the alignment of the soul with reason." You've stopped chasing applause. You've stopped explaining your peace. You've simply started listening to yourself. And when that happens, when your soul starts aligning with something deeper than performance or pressure, you naturally step out of the loop others are stuck in. You stop reacting to every noise. You stop needing to match their energy. And in doing that, you expose how performative their misery has become. But that exposure is not your responsibility. You don't need to argue for your joy. You don't need to justify your healing. You just keep going, not to prove a point, but because you finally realize that joy isn't the destination, it's the fuel. And you need that fuel to keep rising, to keep creating, to keep walking toward the version of yourself that doesn't apologize for feeling okay. Not everyone will clap for your clarity. Some people will throw shade simply because you're standing in the sun. That's fine. Let them sit where they're comfortable. You don't need to convince anyone that your joy is real. Just live it. Let it speak for itself. And if it threatens someone else's sadness, that's a sign that maybe, just maybe, it's time for them to stop hiding in it. Some will rise, others will resist. But either way, you stay in motion, because your happiness doesn't make you fake, it makes you free. And in a world full of people who've normalized their pain, that freedom will always look suspicious. Keep shining anyway. You don't need to explain your light to those still hiding in the dark. Just keep walking, keep healing, keep choosing peace over approval. Because the right people won't fear your growth. They'll grow with you. And when you stop apologizing for becoming who you were always meant to be, that's when everything changes. Watch the next video on your screen when you're ready to take the next step. And thank you for being a part of Stoic Journal, where your stillness becomes your strength.